Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
The chain, tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full, as heavy, and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago, you have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. I see no chain. 9 were invisible until the day of my death, as yours shall be. Tell me more. Speak. Comfort to me. I have none to give. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole.
No doubt of that. You always were a good man of business.
Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
My guest today is historian and theologian Dr. Timothy Larsen. He is McManus Professor of Christian Thought and a Professor of History at Wheaton College, an Honorary Fellow, School of Divinity, the University of Edinburgh, and an Honorary Research Fellow, the School of Theology, Religious Studies, and Islamic Studies, the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. He has been a visiting fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and All Souls College, Oxford, and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute. He is the author or editor of 20 books, including Crisis of Doubt, Honest Faith in 19th Century England, A People of One Book, The Bible and the Victorians, The Slain God, Anthropologist and the Christian Faith, and John Stuart Mill's A Secular Life. He has edited the recent book, The Oxford Handbook of Christmas, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book review editor for the Wall Street Journal says, Timothy Larsen's book, a highly readable collection of 45 essays by well-informed scholars, is a fascinating box of focusing lenses on Christmas, its history, theology, iconography, tradition, and yes, its controversies, including those of the present moment. And we are very pleased to have the distinguished professor, historian, and theologian with us today. Welcome, Dr. Larsen.
I'm glad to be here.
Before we get into the discussion about Christmas, would you tell me a little about the artwork that adorns the cover of the book? It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's a 20th century piece made in 1973 by a Canadian artist, William Kurlick, called the Nightmans Christmas. And Kurlick actually did a whole series of setting the nativity scene in different contemporary scenes of his time in 20th century Canada. And I like it because it's a little getting you back to the reality of something that's not all glossy with, silver and gold and angels and beams. It's more thinking about really being homeless. And they're essentially in a kind of like construction trailer that they've kind of commandeered to be there with the baby. But I think it is an inspiring picture. There are pictures that are a little too kind of gritty that are just trying to make a statement, I think, without actually having anything that anybody who cared about the story devotionally could connect to. So I found it exciting. I liked the image a lot, and it seemed to, I didn't want an image that everybody has seen on a Christmas card 100 times, and so they would just not even look at. I wanted an image that most people hadn't seen, and it would make them stop and think about it.
And really think about the Christmas story. I mean, that's what it really does.
Absolutely. It's getting you into this question again about this couple and their baby, and there being no room for them to stay at this critical time.
Dr. Larsen, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Dad's Oatmeal Cookie Stout from the O'Fallon Brewery of Maryland Heights, Missouri. Dad's Scotch oatmeal cookies are a St. Louis tradition, so O'Fallon has taken key ingredients in Dad's Scotch oatmeal cookies and incorporated them into an oatmeal cream stout. This creamy stout has hints of chocolate, cinnamon, caramel, oat, raisin, and vanilla, all of which combine to create a liquid cookie. The perfect beverage for the holiday season. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest episodes immediately when they are released. And finally, to the legion of listeners from more than 80 countries and 2,000 cities across the planet, I need to say thank you. And now, I raise my Dad's Oatmeal Cookie Stout very high. And to the magic and mystery of Christmas, I say cheers. The Nativity Story is included in only the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. It appears the early church doesn't place a great deal of emphasis on the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, so the earliest gospel is probably Mark, which doesn't have it. It starts with his calling disciples, which is logical because that's what the eyewitnesses would have known, would have had. They would have had his adult ministry of teaching and going around and doing amazing things, and the early community would have included people who knew Jesus and had been witnesses to that. So you have to do research to think about what was the origin story. Jesus clearly was not famous as a child. So however much we have these amazing stories about magi and angels and shepherds, that did not add up to him being a child celebrity. He was an obscure figure until he comes on the scene as an adult, going about teaching and preaching. And so, Luke explicitly says, Luke is most people's favorite nativity passage. It's the one that's there in the Charlie Brown special that's read out and beloved. And, Luke himself says, I had to do research and look into these things carefully in order to write this gospel. And so he's approaching it more as a historian than just as a kind of memoir of an eyewitness. And that's when we get this backstory.
What do you say to the individuals that make the claim that Christmas, or at least the celebrations of Christmas, came from pagan traditions, so Christmas is a pagan holiday?
Yeah, I think that's just a muddled way of thinking. Every culture, when it develops into a new anything, ideology, nation, philosophy, religion, uses the cultural resources that it has. That's what human culture does. What else can you do other than use what you have to hand? So the analogy I use a lot is our 4th of July celebrations for American independence. The red, white, and blue are the national colors of Britain. My Country 'Tis of Thee is the tune of the national anthem of Britain, God Save the King, or God Save the Queen. You could go on and on that way. Apple pie is a traditional English dish long before anybody said as American as apple pie. That just shows you that Britain is older than America. But it would be ridiculous to say, on the 4th of July, Americans are really honoring the British monarchy and are really celebrating Britishness. They're not. They've taken cultural tools and they've now celebrating something else. So what you have are very common cultural resources used across the globe of the light coming into the darkness, the solstice, evergreens being a sign of life during winter. All those things are what anthropologists call natural symbols. And the fact that pagans use them as well doesn't make Christmas pagan.
So when do we first see the celebrations of the birth of Jesus, or the celebrations of what would become Christmas? Is it after the persecutions and in that 4th century time period? Is that the first time that Christmas is celebrated in the church?
Well, the persecution is crucial because, yes, the records that we have come from the 4th century, but you have to get past the persecution to have the church really celebrating in the open and keeping records and to have records that have survived. So that's when we see it showing up, but you don't have anybody saying, let's do this for the first time. It kind of shows up like it's already been happening, and then you're left wondering how long has it been happening. But certainly we have good evidence from the mid-4th century that the annual celebration on December 25th is happening in Christian churches.
So what traditions in Western Christendom developed during medieval times that may still be around today that people would recognize?
Yeah, so many. I think the strong emphasis on music is a very obvious one. It's very clear from medieval records that the most elaborate musical performances of the church year happened at Christmas time. There was a huge competition to secure the best musicians at Christmas time above any other time of the year. So I think many people strongly connect Christmas with music. In fact, when I did the Oxford Handbook of Christmas, one of the things that Oxford came back to me and said is you actually need to have 2 chapters on music and not just one, because it's such an important theme for Christmas. So that's the only theme that has got 2 chapters in the entire handbook. There are 45 chapters. So that's one that comes to mind. But along with that, caroling and wassailing and all of these kind of traditions about getting together with your neighbors and doing things to celebrate. The medieval Christmas was much more communal. It really was something that you would find a way to pull in the community around you to celebrate. They would put on plays. There's feasting, of course. There are traditions that don't exist that are quite wonderful, that are about kind of turning over on its head the hierarchy. A boy would be made bishop and would preside, and somebody would be lord of misrule, who would be just kind of this mischief maker rather than the proper lords of the manor that were out there. And so it was also a time to kind of let off some steam and have a bit of fun.
Well, it seems like Christmas, there's different types of Christmas. You got the ecclesiastical, I guess, part of Christmas, which is the church, and then you have family Christmas, and then you have the public festivals. There are all types of ways to celebrate Christmas.
Yes, absolutely. And those 3 spheres, the focus becomes different at different time periods, in different places, in different religious traditions. So I think all 3 are always in play to a certain extent, but the weighting becomes differently. There have been times when going to church on Christmas Day was a very important cultural phenomenon. If you read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which many people will say, I have read that, but one thing that most people don't notice or reflect on is that Ebenezer Scrooge goes to church on Christmas Day. And Christmas is interesting because unlike Easter, Easter always lands on a Sunday. And so it's kind of, when people go to church, they go to church on Sunday anyway. But Christmas could land at any day of the week. And so you have to think about people going to church on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, on a Thursday, whenever it's landed. And yet Christmas would often, and still does, often, depending on which tradition, generate the largest congregation of the entire year for that church. But nevertheless, having said all that, the communal Christmas part was hugely important for many people for many centuries, that you would get together with lots of neighbors outdoor as a kind of outdoor festival with moving around in kind of big groups, singing, drinking. There's sports. People would play organized sports on Christmas Day as part of the community. But really in our most recent period, starting in the 19th century, the home has won pride of place in certainly America and European traditions, where now you think of quintessentially, I'll be home for Christmas, and being in that domestic context with the immediate family, or a small enough version of the extended family that you can all be in one house for one meal, has become an ideal for many people.
There's a chapter in the book on the Old Testament. Of course, the birth of Jesus is a New Testament story. Why was it important to add the Old Testament, or a chapter on the Old Testament in your book about Christmas?
Yes, because if you go to a Christmas service, you often have a reading from the Old Testament, or multiple readings from the Old Testament. A famous Christmas service is the 9 Lessons and Carols, The one that happens at King's College, Cambridge, is the most famous, broadcast all around the world. Millions of people tune in every year, but many, many churches use that same format. And the 9 lessons are 9 readings from Scripture, and that begins with several readings from the Old Testament. So you have prophecies in the Old Testament about a king coming, about a figure bringing peace, about a king being born in Bethlehem. And so I wanted to look at those texts that are familiar to people who are engaging in worship, going to church, hearing the 9 lessons of carols, going to a service, or even just being woven into music that we listen to. Handel's Messiah tells a lot of the Nativity story through Old Testament quotations, for example.
There's an entire section on the Nativity story, and of course it's about Christmas, so that's going to be a central part of the story. But how does it develop over time? You have the 2 Gospels, doesn't have a great deal of information. How does the entirety of this Nativity story develop over time?
The Nativity story is a very foundational story in the Western imagination. It is there especially in visual art. Many, many paintings by great, great painters from across the centuries, medieval, Renaissance, on, have tried to depict what's going on in those scenes. And so that has filled out our imagination on the Nativity story. And then over time, some of parts of it have been given more specificity. By far, the most is the Magi, or the wise men, who are very mysterious figures. The text doesn't even say how many of them there are, but it quickly is decided that there are 3 because there are 3 gifts. So that's logical. And then it's kind of poetically or theologically decided that they represent and therefore come from the 3 continents of the known world. So you have one who's African, one who's Asian, one who's European, and then they get names, and on it goes. So down through the centuries, through the visual and through some telling of the stories, the Nativity story begins to pick up parts of the legend.
So what do you think Mary did with the gold? Did she invest it wisely for Jesus? So he'd have...
She put it in stocks and not have had this kind of retrograde view that gold was the only way to make an investment, but I'm not sure whether she was smart enough to do that or not.
So if we move on to St. Nicholas, of course, has been a popular figure in church history throughout the history of the church. When does he first start being associated specifically with Christmas? Is it from the beginning?
No, I think it's really strong about the 11th century. Almost, by definition, a tradition is something that kind of grows up without you noticing it, and so everybody asks when things start, but usually, things are happening, people are copying it, and at some point it'll go to a new level, and then everybody will claim that they're the ones who started it because they want to have credit for it, so it's hard to work backwards. But he certainly becomes perhaps the most popular saint in the medieval period, and that claim could be made by the number of churches that are named after him, the devotion to him, and the connection with Christmas is really because what he's known for. I mean, there are several stories about him that are important, but the one that really locks it into Christmas is throwing these bags of gold through a window anonymously, because he doesn't want to take credit for it, so that these poor girls do not get sold into slavery because their father is in debt and bankrupt, but actually can get out of debt and have dowries and live a happy life. And so that idea of a gift giver who is anonymous is really the core of the connection, then, as well as the fact that his own feast day is December 6th, which puts him, at the kind of start of the Christmas season and in Advent.
So what does Jesus' teaching specifically on gift giving, does that have an impact on the way we give and receive gifts at Christmas time?
Yeah, I think so. People don't usually talk about this, but I think there's a connection between Santa Claus and Christ's teaching. Christ says that the best way to give is to give anonymously, that your left hand shouldn't even know what your right hand is doing, a very kind of vivid metaphor for this idea of giving anonymously. And you give anonymously because it's not about you and you taking credit. You're not doing it to show off. You're doing it because you actually want to help somebody, or because somebody will be blessed or grateful for, encouraged by what they received. So I think that the Santa Claus legend was a very Christian-friendly idea, that I can give something and say, this is from St. Nicholas or this is from Santa Claus, and therefore I'm not taking credit for it. We can see that happening already in the medieval period. The earliest one that I know of are some French nuns who would give gifts to poor children, leave them for them secretly, just like he did, and say, from St. Nicholas. They're copying him in making this a anonymous gift that it's not about me, but it's just about this kind of wonder and joy and mystery.
So you mentioned Santa Claus. So where does the name Santa Claus actually come from?
So the legend of Santa Claus really gets going in the 19th century in New York. And it seems to be that English-speaking Protestants in New York are really interested in Dutch culture. You have a whole Dutch-speaking community. It used to be New Amsterdam, New York. And they're just hearing Dutch people talk to each other in Dutch about St. Nicholas. And them trying to imitate what they're saying, they're getting the word Santa Claus.
I do have a question about that. Since you brought up the early colonies and so forth, I know that at least the Puritans, for example, were dissenters, I guess, against Christmas. So how does Christmas survive that period? Is it just that the power of the Puritans wane? Because it seems like that was the real war on Christmas, not the modern one.
Yes, it is. The spirit of Christmas is unstoppable, is the answer. People love Christmas, and you can't shut it down even if you want to. Governments have discovered that over and over again. So, yeah, they argued that it was unbiblical, that, we talked about earlier, maybe it's pagan, maybe it's Catholic in ways that ought to be purged out of the church. But those arguments, when you look at them closely, and we could do that if you want to, that, they kind of fall apart. And so you have a combination of the arguments not actually being very strong arguments, and the populace just loving this festival and not being willing to give it up. And how much can you police whether people are feasting and rejoicing in their homes, and so it was kind of a futile effort.
Moving on to some German traditions, the Christmas tree, for example, is that solely German innovation that's worked its way into modern Christmas celebrations?
Yeah, so the Christmas tree seems to come from a medieval tradition of having a sacred play tell the story of redemption. And it would begin with a tree of life on the stage that was decorated. And that play would be done as part of the Christmas festivities, so it got associated with Christmas. Nevertheless, it's unquestionably true that the kind of general popularizing of the idea that you should yourself have a decorated tree at Christmas time comes from the Germans. The Germans are the early adopters, and that it spreads from there. And it actually is a specifically Protestant tradition. Obviously, the medieval root that I've told you is before Protestantism, but Protestants in Germany are the ones who make it really fashionable to have a tree in the home. And then that spreads to other countries, and eventually even Catholics give in and start having it as well, even though they, for a long time, thought it was very Protestant. There is an exchange that way, actually. Nativity scenes in the home or in the yard were considered explicitly Catholic, but Protestants eventually give in and start doing that as well, even have them in their churches. Protestants also often copied Catholics by having a service which they would even call a midnight mass sometimes, even though they don't usually use the word mass. The Catholics had kind of made that service seem so attractive that Protestants would imitate it. So there's a kind of exchange happening between the traditions.
It's interesting. I think that some of the Protestant traditions today even have started to accept Lent in a way.
Yeah.
The elements of sacrifice or fasting during Lent, some of the Protestants have accepted that as well.
And even the Stations of the Cross during Good Friday. So yeah, there are ways in which good ideas don't have any boundaries when it comes to whoever is trying to police them. And Christmas, I think, is particularly ecumenical, is the word that theologians use, something that kind of blends the traditions. Because, one example that I think of often is everybody sings one another's songs, even in church. Catholics will sing literally Christmas songs written by Martin Luther in Catholic Mass.
Well, he was Catholic at one time.
Yeah, exactly. And many Protestants will say that their favorite Christmas carol is Silent Night, which is written by a Catholic priest.
That's absolutely true. I think you're right about that. If it's a great idea, if it's a great song, it's going to work its way into our celebrations, especially at Christmas time. These Victorian traditions, and I know this is really the area of expertise for you, what are the ones that are almost embedded into our modern Christmas celebrations today that started during the 19th century?
Yes, well, the Christmas card would be one obvious example. The earliest commercial Christmas card is in the 1830s, and you can read reports of postmen saying, "Oh, I think it's just a fad, it won't last," and they just keep coming and coming, and they're like, the next year people are still sending Christmas cards. I can't believe that's not over yet. So that would be, an example. So much of our imagination about Christmas, it comes from reading literature written in the 19th century. And so the way that we think, what you should eat and the decorations you should have, certainly the Christmas tree itself is a 19th century general spread phenomenon, especially in the English-speaking world. Nobody had Christmas trees before the 19th century, and by the end, most everyone does. And, many things accumulate. But I guess most generally, Christmas being the biggest, most important holiday of the year is a 19th century decision. Before the 19th century, that was much more contested. If you were in Scotland, New Year's was the most important holiday by far, and Christmas was often not celebrated. For many Christian traditions, Easter was the most important holiday and clearly outshone Christmas. And the 19th century decides that Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year.
How important was that publication of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert with the Christmas tree and their family into cementing that as something that we all wanted to celebrate? In the United States, they took that image and Americanized it. I know that.
Yeah, it certainly is a crucial way that the idea of a Christmas tree is popularized. It's not inventing it, it's popularizing it. So obviously, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, is himself German. So he's keeping up the German traditions in the royal family. And I think it's the London Illustrated News, this drawing of this wonderful domestic scene of the royal family with their Christmas tree. It was very important for Queen Victoria to signal that the monarchy was about home and family and therefore virtue and stability and not wildness and the old kind of monarchy that was dangerous, which was, gambling and excess and immorality. So she was signaling, no, this is about, a kind of good, virtuous home. And so they have this nice image. But yeah, many, many people see it and say, that's what you should do to celebrate Christmas. You should have a tree in the home. And so in the English-speaking world, I think it is crucial for it becoming a general thing rather than one that was more just communities that had some connection to Germany were doing it already.
I'd like to talk about A Christmas Carol a little bit because it's the first book I ever read, actually.
Oh.
I was at St. John's the Baptist. I was in Catholic school. There's a list of books in the back or a group of books in the back, and you had to choose one. And I chose A Christmas Carol. And so that's the first book I ever read cover to cover. So it's still kind of important for me for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering about Dickens in general. When I think about it as an adult, there was the practice. You go back to medieval times, the lords having festivals or banquets for the less fortunate. That was a tradition that had developed. But during industrialization, that maybe had been lost, or maybe Dickens was picking up on that. If you were part of the wealthy class, you have a responsibility to the rest of society.
Yeah.
It was Dickens, in a way, talking about the industrialization of the world at the time.
Yes, that is exactly what's going on in A Christmas Carol. Everybody agreed that there was this old medieval baronial ideal. So we talked about earlier how much of how we think about Christmas is the Victorian Christmas. Well, for Victorians themselves, they thought about the medieval Christmas. That was their ideal. They would, write stories, and kind of the nostalgia and romanticism was about the barons and their feasts. They would put on these great feasts, and it really was a form of social welfare and obligation and connection, that you were actually providing real practical help to people who are in a much lower place in society than you are. You're inviting them to a feast, but also, some of the traditions that still survive. My daughter is only like 23 years old, and the first year that she worked a full year at her job, they gave her a turkey for Christmas, and so it's like, this still goes on. It's like this kind of ancient, kind of symbolic thing now almost. But in the medieval period, that was like really important. People could not get meat easily, and here is actual aid. And so, but when you get to the industrial period, people have come off the land. These huge cities have blown up that didn't exist before. The agrarian culture is not where most people are. They're working in factories and they're living in towns. And the people who own the factories or do trade or modern business and industry, they don't think of themselves as barons. They don't have titles. They don't have huge estates. They live in town as well. And Dickens wanted to say, yeah, but you are the equivalent today of the people who have more and should think about the people who have less. And you've got to find a way for your charity to flow out to help the good of society, in particular the people that are on the bottom rungs. And that's what he has Ebenezer Scrooge learn in the book. And he really was teaching the entire culture to learn this. And you can read letters of businessmen getting it and changing their ways. I've seen one where a businessman read it and was like, I've always kept my factory open on December 25th, but I think I have to close it this year. And it's like they're starting to see that they need to respond better to the situation.
Well, maybe they were just scared they were going to be visited by three ghosts.
Yeah.
if they didn't watch it.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that entire discussion is I just spoke to someone, I had a podcast not that long ago. It was Dr. May from Purdue, and he wrote a book called Yuletide in Dixie. And he talks about the South and how they use Christmas as a way to show that they were better than the North. And it's really kind of this argument that Dickens was making, that the industrialization of the North had given up on Christmas, it didn't have the Christmas spirit, and we down in the South really know how to celebrate Christmas. Seems like a similar type of situation just in American history.
Yes. So the South kept up the old communal Christmas much longer than the North. The North goes to the domestic Christmas, which I think is partly because they don't know their neighbors and they're afraid of them. Where the South, it's a more organic society, integrated society in terms of knowing who your neighbors are and having a relationship with them. And therefore, they are keeping up some of the older traditions in that way of thinking. But of course, that kind of charity has a really sinister, patronizing side to it. It's about keeping people in their place and expecting them to show deference to you. And that also shows up in the North in various ways. There are all these charities for feeding orphans and poor children and poor people in general on a Christmas feast. But you would have the great and the good, like literally in the balconies, in their fine clothes, watching as this kind of strange, perverse entertainment, these people eat the feast they provided for them. And it has this, like I said, it's kind of sinister feel to it of I'm kind of accentuating the social distinction between you and I through giving charity.
So there are 2 chapters in your book, as you mentioned, on Christmas carols or Christmas music in general.
Yeah.
And it's split up at the year 1900. Maybe you could explain why that is the case. But let's start with the music prior to 1900 and what were some elements of Christmas music that was captured over time. That's a lot of time from the Nativity all the way down to 1900.
They're very early. It's possible that already in the 2nd century, the announcement of the angels to the shepherds, in excelsis Deo, glory to God in the highest, had become a piece of scripture that had been set to music and used in the church. So it's very early. And those kind of nativity-themed music are created by all of the great composers that you can think of. Bach, Mendelssohn, Handel, Vivaldi, they all are creating wonderful oratorios and huge pieces of Christmas music, but also even popular Christmas carols that we sing. Sometimes it's a tune that was by one of those famous composers. So we have what we would just think of as great music, not Christmas music. That is this oratorio by Handel, by Bach, and so on, that is part of the repertoire.
How did the invention of the radio affect Christmas music or the proliferation of Christmas music?
Oh, man, I think it's huge. And it is this kind of permanent passed down nostalgia that, you can turn on, I have a radio station. I live in the Chicago market, and there's a radio station here which just plays the standard, soft rock format all year round, but it switches to a Christmas format for about 6 weeks out of the year. And you hear the voice of Bing Crosby. You hear the voice of Frank Sinatra, Perry Como. These people somehow still are in the rotation. It's not just that it's Christmas music. It's not just Mariah Carey and so on. Why do those voices still come on? And I think the answer is because parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, however the chain works in your family, somebody heard this as a child on the radio and it meant Christmas to them. And they then wanted to replicate that in adulthood. And therefore it became the sound of Christmas for their children and so on, however many links there are now in the chain.
There's a whole section on the book about how art has impacted Christmas over time. And it's not just music, it's paintings and literature, and everything is built up into the Christmas tradition, and even down into modern times in film and TV. And that's all covered in the book too. Yeah,
it's a really, really big part of all of those genres. It is quite possible that, your most famous film, if you're whatever, an actor, could be a Christmas film. Your most famous song as a pop musician could be a Christmas song. It has a way of hitting the culture and sticking. Now, again, not everything, but Christmas art can become sticky in a way that other things become ephemeral because Christmas comes around every year. And so if it gets into the canon, man, you have got it, and you've got it good.
Yeah, and there's no way to get rid of it either.
But if the royalties keep coming, is what I'm saying.
Yes, yeah, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but, if you take Michael Bublé, for example, he was so good at capturing some of those Christmas classics. He has that very classic way of singing that he can't escape it at this point. I think he's just fully embraced it. He might as well just embrace it.
Yeah, you have to make your choice, but it is, I think, almost a sneaky way to kind of make a shot at, could I have a song that actually endures? And many, many people who release songs the same year as some of the greatest Christmas pop songs that come around every year, those songs are now gone. So they found a way to stay.
And as you mentioned before, Christmas always wins. You can fight it, but Christmas always wins.
Yes.
You also have a section in the book, Christmas Around the World. What were some of the most interesting things that you uncovered in that section?
Yeah, I was just completely fascinated by the cultural Christmas of Japan, which is completely outside the box for me. In truth, the author of the Asian chapter doesn't focus on this very much, but me having to do all the research on Christmas to edit this book and write my own chapter. So in Japan, the traditional Christmas meal is Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC. That is like really deep into the culture, as deep thing to do. It's Christmas, let's have KFC. And it's also very much like our St. Valentine's Day. It's a big date day at Christmas. You have to have a date or you're a loser. So get your date and get your bucket of chicken and Merry Christmas. And that was just so much fun for me to think about, because it's like, here is a very different kind of way of having this global holiday work itself out in a completely different context.
Did you want to uncover any circumstances where Christmas is kind of forbidden, but there's elements of it that crop up, say, in the Middle East?
Oh, yes, everywhere. And you have, governments sometimes actually trying to make replacements. The Soviet Union actually created a character, I can't remember precisely, but he's called something like Grandfather Frost. And they tried to come up with a mythical character, to substitute for Santa Claus and St. Nicholas and Christmas and turn it into a secular Soviet holiday. And you see that happening in other places. There are countries in the Middle East where you can be fined if you wear a Santa's cap. So, yeah, there's definitely this push and pull of it being so culturally dominant. It's like countries that are annoyed that people are speaking English rather than the national language. And it's like it's so hard to stop because all of this film and music is putting this before you all the time. And Christmas is coming into cultures that way and tends to find a place even if it's not officially part of the traditions of that culture.
I know there's some criticism, and that kind of leads me to my last question, which is about the war on Christmas. But if you look, it seems as if there are more people from more regions, not only of the country, but of the entire world, that are celebrating some aspect of Christmas today or a Christmas tradition than ever before.
Yes, it's a very strange thing. You know, I think literally the same people in almost the same breath can tell you that Christmas is being canceled and then also start complaining that it's become so overblown, you know? So it's like, choose one. And yeah, Christmas is the biggest global annual celebration that there is, full stop. It takes up 10% of the year. You know, again, as we said, you know, try escaping it. Good luck to you. See, whither will you go? In fact, many Christmas movies are based on that theme. If somebody wants to get away from Christmas but can't, it follows them and tracks them down. So yeah, it is not in any way being canceled. There is no war on Christmas. Christmas is a federal holiday in the United States, which in itself is quite remarkable.
That is.
Because it's the only federal holiday that has a explicit kind of religious origin. So yeah, Christmas is getting bigger, if anything, every year.
I recently spent a year in Saudi Arabia, and of course, they did not celebrate Christmas. I was there at Christmas time, and it was not celebrated, but
yeah.
They are real fans of popular culture, popular music, and popular movies. Most people probably don't realize that about Saudi Arabia, but it's definitely the case. I could see where something like Christmas, if it were allowed, could develop just elements of it. Maybe start with the Christmas tree or a Christmas party. Because even in areas of the world like that, I think there's a yearning for that type of celebratory activity.
It's a very human thing. It's hard to fight a party. You know, it's like religious traditions. You know, nobody's going to celebrate your fast day if you're not all in for this religion. But if you're giving out high quality baked goods and people can come over and drink or whatever, you know, it's like, you know, okay, tell me what day it is. I'm in. And I don't know I would love to hear your experience of Saudi Arabia, but I wonder if, like, you know, the shops are a little more full of merchandise and maybe a little more spruced up with displays. You know, it's like there are kind of ways in which it's not quite the same as it is in a random day in March or whatever, even though we're not officially celebrating.
I will tell you the strangest thing I encountered. So if you go into a department store and, for example, if they're selling, say, pool toys, and a lady is dressed in a swimsuit, they cover it over with tape. They just take tape and cover over the box.
Yep.
Well, they also have Christmas lights, but they're not called Christmas lights. And there was a case where we picked up a box, and I'm in the Army, and so that was the connection. That's the reason I was there. So me and this couple of soldiers who picked up, they thought, check this out. It was a Christmas tree, but it was blocked out with tape, but it was still in the shape of a Christmas tree. Yeah. So there's some efforts, but like you said, you can't win. You can't beat Christmas.
Yeah, and it's not hard to just market it as festive lights or whatever, you know, and let people figure it out themselves, you know.
The interesting thing is the other day I also saw someone share something that said the war on Christmas will end when its illegal occupation of November ceases or something like that. Well, the last thing I have for you is I'm just wondering, maybe what's your favorite Christmas movie? Because we all have our favorite Christmas movie, Dr. Larsen.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with my second favorite. My favorite is It's a Wonderful Life, but that is such an obvious answer that it won't interest people that much. My second favorite is less known by people. It's called The Bishop's Wife.
Oh, yeah, sure.
With Cary Grant and David Niven. Actually, I really enjoy the remake as well, called The Preacher's Wife, with Whitney Houston and Denzel Washington. They're both great movies. And I'm not a person who cries very often in my normal life, but It's a Wonderful Life, The Bishop's Wife, and The Preacher's Wife can all get to me every time. And like all three of them are really about appreciating the life that you have now, despite the fact that you kind of spent the year kind of chafing against the things that limit you and frustrate you and taking things for granted and trying to do something bigger and better with your life. And now is the moment to look around and see the people that love you and that you love them and the life that you have now and why it matters.
Well, thanks, Dr. Larsen. The book is incredibly comprehensive with all kinds of different individuals compiling to tell the Christmas story, which is amazing. So thank you very much.
I've enjoyed this.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I would like to thank my guest, theologian and historian, Dr. Timothy Larsen. And if you would like to get his book, The Oxford Handbook of Christmas, simply click on the link in the description below. The featured brew was Dad's Oatmeal Cookie Stout from the O'Fallon Brewery of Maryland Heights, Missouri. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. All of the directories have a very easy-to-use sharing function. If you want more information on the books and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, where you can now listen to entire episodes. The music was provided by the outstanding North Carolina band Bones Fork, and their new album, Beautiful Circle, would make an excellent Christmas gift. If you'd like to order that, just click on the link. It's in the description below as well. And finally, to the listeners and supporters from around the globe, once again, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
No fog. No mist. Clear. Bright. Cold. Cold. Piping for the blood to dance to. Hello! What's today?
Eh?
Well, what's today, my fine fellow?
Today? Why, it's Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day. Have you missed it? The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, they can do anything they like. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow.
Hello.
Do you know the poulterers in the next street?
Of course I do.
Have they sold the prize turkey hanging in the window? The big one?
What, the one as big as me?
That's it, still. Boy.
Yeah, it's still there.
Good, go buy it.
You're jossing.
No, go buy it in my name. And tell them to bring it straight here. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you 2.